While my husband and I were waiting to see an OBGYN at the hospital, where we were getting treated for infertility, a nurse approached my husband and started talking to him. "Good afternoon, sir. How's your daughter feeling?" Excuse me. I think you have the wrong person. I'm infertility, and we don't have any children as of yet." I thought this was a strange thing to say to someone who wasn't at the hospital the previous night, but she seemed genuinely convinced she saw him less than 24 hours prior. I gave her a reality check and told her I was infertile, and the surprise on her face seemed rather over the top for being told something that was obvious. The next moment, the nurse walked away as she had sensed something she shouldn't have, but I was suspicious and followed her to ask about it. This is a story of how quickly one's efforts to improve the situation regarding childbearing can instantly become meaningless, and how it's sometimes essential to accept what you willingly contributed to and do what you can to fix it. Hopefully we'll learn that while rightful, lawful revenge can be very satisfactory, it can also demand a lot of humanity from those involved. My name is Kaya Alpery. I'm a 30-year-old career woman working in a local office. My husband Stanley and I were classmates in high school and in college, and our relationship lasted a good 7 years before getting married when I was 23 years old. We both loved children, and from the beginning of our marriage, we always talked about how we wanted to have children as soon as possible. I had heard that the ideal age for conception is between 25 and 35, and I wanted to be pregnant during this period then. However, despite our efforts, conceiving a child proved to be more difficult than we'd hoped, and we both got ourselves examined for potential infertility. I discovered that I had uterine fibroids, which are growths made from muscle and tissue that form in or in the wall of our uterus. They're classified as a kind of tumor, but more often than not, they're benign, asymptomatic and painless, which made it difficult to diagnose at first without proper examination. These made conceiving a child difficult, and after discussing it at time and time again with Stanley, we decided to have an infertility treatment. At first, my husband was opposed to the idea, but because I still had a few years to go before I turned 35, but I desperately begged him to make it more likely for us to make our dream come true. He finally reluctantly agreed to the treatment. However, unlike urban areas, there were only a few hospitals in our area that even have obstetrics or gynecology department, much less that offered gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonist. I wasn't ready to get any surgery anytime soon, and because I didn't have anemia nor any pain, this treatment method, which uses medications that shrink fibroids, seemed the best option for me. They're sometimes used to shrink fibroid before surgery, but for the time being, with my own concerns, I wanted to take them to reduce the fibroid sizes. But because these medications are temporary, I needed a reliable place to go on once in every few days to know how my progress is going. After much research and consideration, we found out that I could receive this treatment at only general hospital in our area, and we decided to go there. At first, Stanley seemed to act as though he had no choice but to come along with me, but as he went to the hospital, the more he seemed to get along with me with the doctors and ask many questions enthusiastically, gathering any information that could prove to be essential for improving the situation. I was able to see once again that he was eager to have a child, and more than anything, I was happy that he was willing to help me go this treatment. However, it has been almost 2 years since we started this treatment, and I still had not been able to conceive. There were times when I wondered if I should continue with the expensive treatment or with the surgery, but each time I did.
I'm right here with you. You don't have to do it alone.
I was always encouraged by his words, and they really helped me stay determined to fix the problem. I would really have lost heart very quickly if I had to go to the hospital several times a month by myself. That's why Stanley's presence at my side was so important to me. One day, he took half a day off the next day for our appointment to go to the doctor's office together. As usual, I was relaxing with him in the living room at around 6:30 in the evening when his cell phone rang. He told me it was for work and left the living room after answering the call with his usual, "Ahoy, you've reached Stanley Albury." It was so hard not to laugh at that time for the first few months after he started working full-time when we're still dating. It was so good and so unique and made him seem like an eccentric, which he was, to be honest. After a while, he came back, but he seemed a bit distraught. "What was that? Are you okay?"
Sorry, honey. Looks like one of our client companies was expecting a large delivery from ours, but apparently it didn't arrive. I've got to go back to the office now to check in on things, and I might even have to head down to Chicago to negotiate in real time.
We lived in Cleveland, and a single trip to Chicago would either cost a whole lot of money or a whole lot of time. It's too late now, though. What about our doctor's appointment tomorrow?
I really can't say if I'll make it or not. If I'm not back by morning, I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to go to the hospital alone this time.
Okay. He said he was sorry one more time and left. I was instantly worried, even though I knew I had no choice but to accept that the matter was going to be regarding his job and that it couldn't be helped. I was beginning to gain weight and feeling a little under the weather lately, partly due to the hormones I was taking along with the treatment, but I didn't think that Stanley's absence would make me feel this anxious. The next morning, as I was getting ready to go to the hospital alone, Stanley came home right in the nick of time. He looked a little tired, but I was relieved to hear that his workplace seemed to be able to cope with the situation without him actually going down to Chicago. "That's great. I'm really glad nothing too major happened." I called out to him, was taking a quick shower and getting dressed, and he was smiling brightly when he came back out.
It's a little late, but I hope we'll be on time for your appointment.
I called earlier to make sure it was okay. They'll only shift our appointment a bit, and it shouldn't be a problem. I waited for him to finish getting ready and we headed out to the hospital. There was the time of our appointment had changed by about an hour, and since we were the ones who delayed the appointment, there was nothing we could do about it. My husband and I sat in the chairs in the waiting hall. The hospital was very crowded because it was only a general hospital around here. Unable to concentrate on the book I had brought with me, I instead watched the people coming and going into the hall. Since the outpatient fertility clinic was on the same floor as the outpatient pediatric clinic, there were many women with large bellies or small children. I watched them with an indescribable feeling of envy, anxiety, and a little jealousy mixed in, wondering if one day I would be like them. Then a nurse walking from the pediatrician's office approached Stanley. At the nurse's words, he hid his face with the magazine he was reading. "I'm sorry you had a rough night last night, but I'm glad she didn't end up in the hospital." Unlike me, the nurse didn't seem bothered by his attitude and continued talking to him. "And you left your wallet at the office, Mr. Albury. It's a little unusual in color, so if you tell them the characteristics, the folks in admin should be able to find it." On behalf of my silent husband, I called out to the nurse. "Excuse me, I think you might be mistaking my husband for someone else named Albury. I'm infertility, and we're going under treatment, and we don't have a child yet." "What?" The nurse tried taking another look at Stanley's secluded face again in surprise that was altogether too over the top for something that was obvious. We didn't have children, and Stanley hadn't come to the hospital the evening prior. He instead gone out of the office. The nurse was about to say, "Isn't this the gentleman sitting next to you? Didn't he?" before falling silent instead. "I'm sorry. You're right, ma'am. I mistook your husband for someone else. My humblest apologies, as you were." The nurse was about to say, before falling silent instead. I felt uncomfortable about two things. One, that Stanley trying not to be seen by the nurse, and two, the nurse left us two alone as though something important dawned on her, something that she shouldn't have known at all. I felt something strange when I glanced at my husband. Were his hands trembling? I wondered what was going on. He smiled awkwardly as he saw the nurse walking away. "I guess the fact that there were people like you in this world is pretty true, huh?"
I guess so. I wonder how much you look like that other Mr. Albury.
I don't know. I'd love to meet such a person someday.
I wonder how much we'd look alike for real. Yeah, I'd like to meet him too.
Sorry, honey, I'm gonna go to the bathroom. I told my husband I had gone to the bathroom, when instead I went and followed the nurse. When she noticed me, she looked away awkwardly, but I didn't care. I just called out to her. Excuse me, nurse? Does the gentleman you were talking about a few minutes ago really look like my husband? No, I was just mistaken, ma'am. I was convinced by the nurse's complete refusal to make eye contact with me that she wasn't telling the truth. I would have pressed that for the truth, but I was sure that I persisted trying to get her to talk. She would not be able to give me any more information because of her compliance to work ethic protocol. I see. I'm sorry for holding you up when you're so busy. My apologies too, ma'am. No, everyone makes mistakes. No harm done. The nurse seemed a little relieved to hear my words and left. When I returned to the waiting room, Stanley was still sitting with a magazine spread out, thinking. No matter how many times I come here, I always get lost in the vastness of the building. Oh, so they haven't called you to the doctor's office yet? It's a long wait, and you're getting pretty bored, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm actually getting a little sleepy.
Why don't you take a nap? I'll wake you when they call us. You had a rough night last night. Anyway, didn't you?
Yeah, I think I'll do that.
Stanley was blatantly relieved and smiling despite the fact that I had intentionally used the nurse's words. Perhaps I wanted to see a sign with this expression that could give away some information, since I had next to none, or just a hunch. But if the nurse's words had been enough to turn him in my tail, he would have figured it out a long time ago. I decided to back off for now at this point. I figured I just could let him off guard and find out what was going on in my own time. An hour later, I was finally finished with my update. Stanley was outside the hospital, checking his cell phone messages. He told me he had gone to work while I was waiting for the bill, and then he left by himself. I saw him off and went to the detective agency on the same day. 3 weeks later, I received a report from the agency I had hired. I was stunned to see more evidence of my husband's infidelity than I had expected. The woman whom he was having an affair with was a former employee of the same workplace as he, and her name was Tamara Goggins. She and my husband have a little girl, Bethany, who is now almost 2 years old. During the 2 weeks the agency had been investigating, photographs of Stanley going in and out of the woman's house several times, and of him going in and out of the hospital. I frequent myself with his daughter in his arms several times on different dates have been captured. I decided to call my parents and in-laws over to my house over the weekend. Both sets of my parents have been told beforehand about what was going on the day, so their expressions were hard in the living room. My parents, in particular, were glaring at my husband. Stanley himself was utterly perplexed by the situation and asked me,
What's the matter? Going so far as to invite both our parents to our discussion? You told me you wanted to talk to me about something.
Just as I was about to open my mouth, the intercom rang. Excuse me, it seems our final guest is here. I went to the front door and greeted the last guest I had invited for the day's discussion. As soon as Stanley saw who it was, he turned blue and became speechless.
Gah! What the?
Now that we're all here, I'd like to have a word with you, Stanley Albury.
What the hell is going on here?
I think you know better than anyone else, to be quite honest.
Sit down.
He tried to sit down next to me, but Mr. Albury, my father-in-law, stopped him. After confirming that my husband was seated away from me, his father was watching his every move. I took out the photographs from the report from the detective agency and began to talk as I laid them out one by one. The other day, I was concerned about the way you and the nurse were behaving at the hospital, so I asked the detective agency to investigate what's been going on with you.
What?
Do you think you could fake it so well? Maybe you thought no one would recognize you, But lest we forget about two things. One, there are a lot of patients who go to the hospital around here, and given that's literally the only general hospital within a 3-mile radius. And two, the pediatric department and the OBGYN departments are both on the same floor. If you went to the pediatrician with your daughter the day we went to the OBGYN for our appointment, assuming that the nurses were all working back-to-back days, then of course, one of them was bound to notice you. I guess you were just being careless and I would just happen to find the first clue.
I was just unlucky.
Anyway, could you focus on the evidence for a little? This is the evidence of your affair with Miss Goggins. I read out the contents of the report and everyone in the room fell silent.
You damn bastard. No, that's...
I heard that the general idea from Kaya yesterday, but that was information about how you'd been cheating on her. I would never have dreamed you would do such a scandalous thing, much less go so far as to have an illegitimate child with another woman. Considering the age of your child, your relationship has been going on for almost 3 years, right?
Yes, you're right.
The woman known as Tamara was silent all the while, rattled and trembling over the looming premonition of how bad the potential consequences of her actions could be. She knew full well what would happen if I found out about her relationship with my husband, and yet I sighed and decided to continue. Now that you have children, we ought to separate.
Why are you acting like you're the bigger man here?
I may be perceived as such, indeed, but as the guilty spouse, you legally can't ask for a divorce. If I don't agree to a divorce set by your terms, it won't happen.
If you were capable of conceiving children in the first place, I wouldn't have cheated on you at all, Kaya. I resent that attitude of yours when you yourself have never been able to give us what we wanted most.
Then why didn't you just divorce me first and then go out with this woman?
I was unhappy with you, but I put up with it. I put up with your stupid uterine fibroids and the resulting infertility, and I even accepted your sudden, strong request for fertility treatment. But as soon as you started treatment, you gained weight, and even after 2 years, and only God knows how much money, you've made no progress towards becoming fertile again. You admit you even had your flaws.
I never said I didn't. I'm well aware that my infertility was the cause of your dissatisfaction with our marriage, and I'm genuinely sorry about that. I know that I gained weight during the infertility treatment process, and I hoped you would understand that it was inevitable because of the medication. But I'm also sorry that you felt bad about our relationship, that you couldn't even bother coming to me to communicate your concerns. But I don't think that any of my own flaws excuses you from having an affair with another woman despite remaining married to me. If my infertility was the cause, then you should have divorced me first before you started dating Tamara. By the time I suggested getting infertility treatment, you already had Bethany with Miss Goggins here, didn't you? And yet it was you who went on with the relationship with her without divorcing me. I can no longer trust you as a husband or as a human being. This is the main reason why I'm asking you for a divorce. We immediately started living separate from each other and continued our legal discussions. My parents were on my side as well as my in-laws, but Stanley insisted it was ridiculous and cruel to, quote, demand alimony from me despite having children. This was more than enough to tell me he wasn't willing to give in so quickly, and it became a problem. Stanley did indeed had a daughter with Tamara, so I did not want to charge them an amount that would interfere with the little girl's life, as she herself had absolutely no fault in this, but I still demanded about $25,000 each, including the fees to pay my lawyer. Stanley had to get rid of his car and other things as well, as they used up all their savings to pay the amount I demanded, and he was not happy about that at all. Later on, I don't know if it was because of the messy divorce process or because of adultery within the workplace, but I heard Stanley was fired from his company. I was also told that he was disowned by his parents, and that he had to live and work alone for the sake of his wife and child. Part of me felt sorry for Bethany, and another part of me thought good riddance against those two traitors. Then, a few years after our divorce was finalized, my ex-husband called me out of the blue on my cell phone. The call was from an unlisted number, and I answered, only to realize later that I should have changed my cell phone contact information after the legalities were settled. What do you want?
Damn, that's cold. It's your husband calling you. You ought to sound nicer and more loving.
You're my ex-husband, remember?
If we get married again, I'll be your husband again, right? But that's not what I want to say first. It's about my daughter, Bethany, the one I thought I had back then. See, as she was growing up, I wondered why she didn't look like me at all. So I had a DNA test done. And it turns out she wasn't my own daughter, so I broke up with Tamara. That's why I decided to start over with you. You really are the only one.
While my husband and I were waiting to see an OBGYN at the hospital, where we were getting treated for infertility, a nurse approached my husband and started talking to him. Good afternoon, sir. How's your daughter feeling? Excuse me. I think you have the wrong person. I'm infertility, and we don't have any children as of yet. I thought this was a strange thing to say to someone who wasn't at the hospital the previous night, but she seemed genuinely convinced she saw him less than 24 hours prior. I gave her a reality check and told her I was infertile, and the surprise on her face seemed rather over the top for being told something that was obvious. The next moment, the nurse walked away as she had sensed something she shouldn't have, but I was suspicious and followed her to ask about it. This is a story of how quickly one's efforts to improve the situation regarding childbearing can instantly become meaningless, and how it's sometimes essential to accept what you willingly contributed to and do what you can to fix it. Hopefully we'll learn that while rightful, lawful revenge can be very satisfactory, it can also demand a lot of humanity from those involved. My name is Kaya Alpery. I'm a 30-year-old career woman working in a local office. My husband Stanley and I were classmates in high school and in college, and our relationship lasted a good 7 years before getting married when I was 23 years old. We both loved children, and from the beginning of our marriage, we always talked about how we wanted to have children as soon as possible. I had heard that the ideal age for conception is between 25 and 35, and I wanted to be pregnant during this period then. However, despite our efforts, conceiving a child proved to be more difficult than we'd hoped, and we both got ourselves examined for potential infertility. I discovered that I had uterine fibroids, which are growths made from muscle tissue that form in or in the wall of our uterus. They're classified as a kind of tumor, but more often than not, they're benign, asymptomatic and painless, which made it difficult to diagnose at first without proper examination. These made conceiving a child difficult, and after discussing it at time and time again with Stanley, we decided to have an infertility treatment. At first, my husband was opposed to the idea, but because I still had a few years to go before I turned 35, but I desperately begged him to make it more likely for us to make our dream come true. He finally reluctantly agreed to the treatment. However, unlike urban areas, there were only a few hospitals in our area that even have obstetrics or gynecology department, much less that offered gonadotropin releasing hormone agonist. I wasn't ready to get any surgery anytime soon, and because I didn't have anemia nor any pain, this treatment method, which uses medications that shrink fibroids, seemed the best option for me. They're sometimes used to shrink fibroid before surgery, but for the time being, with my own concerns, I wanted to take them to reduce the fibroid sizes. But because these medications are temporary, I needed a reliable place to go on once in every few days to know how my progress is going. After much research and consideration, we found out that I could receive